For guests just arriving, welcome to the 2020 Taiwan International Journalism Conference. The conference will begin in 1 minute. As a protective measure in response to COVID-19 and to help ensure the health and safety of all participants, please wear a mask at all times. Your cooperation is greatly appreciated. Also, the simultaneous interpretation service is available in Mandarin and English. If you would like to borrow a simultaneous translation device, please kindly bring a piece of identification and refer to the information desk by the entrance. Kindly note that all devices have been disinfected accordingly. A reminder that with exception of bottled water, eating and drinking is prohibited in the hall. Please also switch your mobile device to silent or vibration mode. Thank you for your attention, and we will begin in 1 minute. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the 2020 Taiwan International Journalism Conference. My name is April, and it is my pleasure to be your MC today. Reporters Without Borders is an international nonprofit organization based in Paris, which is committed to defending freedom of information throughout the world. The RSF East Asia Bureau opened in 2017 in Taipei, focusing on the East Asian territories, China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, and Mongolia. The Bureau serves as a strategic platform for operating the RSF missions in the region, monitoring, advocacy, public awareness campaigns, and assistance and security training for journalists. And today we are honored to have you join us to learn more about journalism in the post-COVID era. Now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Cedric Alviani, the head of Reporters Without Borders, East Asia Bureau, to begin today's conference by delivering the opening remarks. Mr. Cedric Alviani.
Thank you, April. Well, Reporters Without Borders is delighted to cooperate again with the National Central Library and with the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy for the second Taiwan International Journalism Conference. I would like to extend our warm thanks to the Ministry of Culture, the Canadian Trade Office, and all media partners that made this event possible. This world is engulfed in pandemics, war, terrorism, inequalities, environmental destruction. So protecting press freedom may not seem in the highest priority. However, none of these issues can be addressed without independent reporting. Without journalists, the respect of human rights, the respect of the rule of law can simply not be guaranteed. This conference, we hope, will contribute to the promotion of press freedom and a quality media environment in the East Asia, so that hopefully the right of the public to receive accurate information and hold the powerful accountable can be better enforced. Last year, we had very fruitful discussions on disinformation and its possible solutions. This year, we're going to explore how the COVID-19 crisis has made even more necessary a free flow of information, and we'll try to anticipate the role of journalism and journalists in the post-COVID era. I extend our warmest thanks to the experts who will share their knowledge today, to the Reporters Without Borders team also in Taipei and in Paris that made this event possible, and of course to you, the audience, who are following this event either in person or virtually this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Alviani. Please kindly take a seat. Now, let us begin with today's Taiwan International Journalism Conference. I would like to ask everyone to join me in welcoming Mr. Zhide Li, member of the Standing Committee at the Association of Taiwan Journalists, 知德 was based in Hong Kong from 2018 to 2019 and will be giving the first keynote speech today, which will discuss the impact of national security law on Hong Kong journalists.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Li Zhide. Today, at the RSF conference, I would like to talk about the impact of national security law on Hong Kong journalists. We know that when we talk about press freedom in Hong Kong, we need to talk about the impact of national security law. And since 2019 and earlier times, we have seen how press freedom has been squeezed in Hong Kong. And in the last year, this has been further exacerbated. We can predict what the future challenges will be for the media in Hong Kong. And I think these challenges are pertinent not just to Hong Kong journalists, but also to the East Asian region and for journalists across the world. When we talk about 2019, I think this is a very important turning point. If we look at earlier times, for example, look at this photograph here. We know the person sitting on the one side is an official called Zhong Shiyuan in Hong Kong, and he was serving on the Executive Council in Hong Kong. He was one of the highest-ranking Chinese officials in Hong Kong. And in June of 1984, he met with Deng Xiaoping. And at the time, the Sino-British talks had already begun. It was decided that Hong Kong was going to be returned to China, and the handover was beginning. Mr. Zhong was talking on behalf of the people of Hong Kong, and during June of 1984, he went to Beijing to meet with the leader of China, Deng Xiaoping. And during that meeting, Deng Xiaoping mentioned to him that when people talked about the handover of Hong Kong sovereignty, many people called it a three-legged stool. Deng Xiaoping said there isn't a three-legged stool, only a two-legged stool. What did Deng Xiaoping mean? He meant that when Hong Kong was to be returned to China, the civil society in Hong Kong hoped that there would be three pillars. One is the UK government, the other the Chinese government, and then the third, the people of Hong Kong. However, Deng Xiaoping said very clearly at the time, your expectation will not be considered. Once the handover becomes official, the people of Hong Kong will not have proper representation. So we can see even as early as 1984, Deng Xiaoping made it very clear the position of Hong Kong. So for the people of Hong Kong, we can see their hope that in 50 years, things will not change. And in the end, their future could not be determined by themselves. It was always the business of the British and the Chinese. And during that meeting, the Hong Kong official Zhong Shiyuan mentioned he had three concerns. The first concern was Hong Kong people will not be able to govern Hong Kong. And second, he was worried that after 1997, many Hong Kong officials would not be able to execute the policies of the central government, and they would face a lot of intervention. And the third concern was that this ideal of 50 years of the status quo would actually fall apart. And we can see that these three concerns were very, very valid. It became a prophecy of Hong Kong's future. All of his concerns have been proven to be very relevant. And in 2019, I mentioned this was a watershed year. Before 2019, let's look at 2018. There was an issue of Victor Mallet, a journalist from the Financial Times. And we can see that in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in China, many people feel that this is not something that is too unforeseen, because during August of 2018, there was a member of the Hong Kong People's Party who attended a lecture, and he was there to talk about his views on Hong Kong independence. And for many journalists who were there, when they listened to a talk relating to the political development of Hong Kong, they should have the liberty and freedom to report as they see fit. However, the editor of the Financial Times, Mr. Victor Mallet, he reported on this event, and later when he was applying for his work visa, it was rejected. He had to leave Hong Kong as a result. Later, he wanted to go back as a visitor to collect his things, but his application was still rejected by the Hong Kong government. So through the Victor Mallet incident, we can say that this was an important milestone for the future of press freedom. We can see that the Hong Kong government began to crack down on the application of visas for certain journalists. In China, this was probably nothing new, but in 2018 in Hong Kong, I think this was a very important watershed moment. We can also see Hong Kong's ranking in terms of press freedom started to fall. This is a Media Watch organization's survey, and you can see it shows from 2012 all the way, from 2002 all the way to 2020. So 18 years of Hong Kong's development in press freedom. And if you look at 2012 as an important period of demarcation, you can see that from 2002 all the way to 2010, there were ups and downs. But after that period, press freedom began to fall significantly. And in 2011, we can see that the Premier of China, Li Keqiang, was visiting Hong Kong at the time, and the police force of Hong Kong had a few issues with journalists, and the police force cracked down on many journalists who were covering this event. And since 2011, we saw a steady decline in press freedom in Hong Kong, and this has resulted in the current dire situation. Now, I also want to talk about the important anti-extradition law amendment bill movement. This is a very, very important movement because many people felt that the Hong Kong press was biased in its reporting. We know in Hong Kong, the two colors are yellow and blue, and many people felt that journalists were pro Hong Kong or pro people to yellow. Also, it was a very, very popular protest movement. So we saw that be it the general public with the police or journalists and the police, there were lots of confrontations. And when it came to the police and journalists, we saw quite a few incidents where police arrested reporters, and as a result, the freedom of journalists were restricted. Many of you already know the background of the anti-extradition law, so I will skip that. But what I want to emphasize is this movement, this protest movement, has still not ended even today. This was a large-scale movement, and we can see that there were a total of 10,000 people who were arrested for participating in this protest. And if we look at the average population of Hong Kong, we can say that out of every 750 Hong Kong citizen, one person was arrested for joining in this movement. Many people may say 10,000 people arrested, that's not a huge number, but if you look at it in terms of the overall population, this is a very significant number. Another number that I would like to share with you is the number of prisoners who were imprisoned due to participation in this movement. It is actually fewer than the number of people arrested, but still it's more than the total of people who are in prison for other reasons. So this is also a very important statistic to keep in mind. During this movement, we saw many conflicts arise between the police and journalists. One event I would like to highlight is last year in November, when the police force in Hong Kong were intervening with press freedom. How did they intervene? For example, they have torches, and they would use these torches to shine a light on the eye of the journalist or the cameraman, so it's hard for them to operate their cameras. They also had so-called violent behavior towards journalists, where rubber bullets were shot at the backs of journalists, or pepper spray and tear gas were targeted or directed at journalists. And in November, this came to a standstill where 6 journalists from 6 different organizations, they decided to protest silently. Very often, if you ask police, what should you do about something like this, they will just deny that it happened at all. So the journalists came up with a very creative way where 6 journalists at this press conference wore a slogan on their head. And if you put it all together, it says we need to investigate into police brutality and stop police from lying. And this was a silent protest. And when the police officials came into this press conference, they saw this and they left the room, and they requested that the journalists had to take down these banners, these protest slogans. These 6 journalists refused to do so, and in the end, the press conference was called off. So this incident is very interesting in that if we look at media ethics, we usually will say journalists shouldn't turn the limelight on themselves. They shouldn't be the star attraction during a press conference. So this is a debatable form of behavior. But if you look deeper, you will see that this is a form of protest where journalists needed to directly target police brutality towards journalists. I also want to talk about how journalists in Hong Kong suffered many mental breakdowns and disorders. According to a survey that was done by Hong Kong University, there were a total of 11,000 journalists who felt journalists filled in this survey voluntarily, but they felt that 40% of them said they suffered from PTSD symptoms. Over 70% felt that they were moderately to seriously depressed, and 36% had both of these symptoms. In addition to journalists, there were also social workers interviewed, and there are also many volunteer medical workers. They had to suffer a great deal of anxiety and mental disorders as a result of the high-pressure tactics on the part of the police force in Hong Kong. We also like to look at what the government did to restrict press freedom in Hong Kong. First, they created this notion of so-called fake journalists. The press were portrayed as being made up of many people who were not really journalists.
Journalists can identify themselves as journalists so that they can stay on site to cover the story, to cover the police brutality or the protest by the demonstrators. And that is the calling and the job of the journalist. But in the entire anti-extradition amendment movement, we saw there were civil journalists from schools, from civil organizations, or from newly emergent media, and much of that was online media. These new journalists went on site to cover the stories and to shoot photographs. Maybe there was a certain level of misbehavior by these journalists, but the government defined these journalists as fake press or fake journalists and asked them to leave the site. I think this is an excuse of accusing these people as the so-called fake journalists. This is an excuse used by the government in order to decide who can be considered to be journalists and who are not. And by September this year, the Hong Kong police amended the Police General Orders, the PGO. Why is there Police General Orders? Because the relationship between the police and the journalist is governed under Police General Orders, the PGO, in Hong Kong Code. So on the site, who's a journalist or who's not is defined, in fact, in the PGO. First of all, if a person has an ID from the broadcasting system from a media, then this person is considered a journalist. The second condition, if this person is a member of Hong Kong Correspondent Association, or the association issues such an identification to the journalist then can identify themselves as journalists on site and tell the police that we're journalists and we're going to stay to cover the story. If you are a photographer from a media, you will have your ID as well, and this person will be considered to be a journalist. However, then the police started to accuse many of these journalists as fake journalists. So the government started to say that, oh, the Hong Kong Journalists Association are selling their IDs. If you want to purchase, you can't just simply pay and get an ID from the association. So the police of Hong Kong decided to amend the Police General Orders and to change the 3 conditions to 2 conditions to identify the person as journalist. So now, only people who have registered with the media department of the government can be considered journalists. So to put it simply, they have to register with the government too. And if the media is not a local media in Hong Kong, and then you also need to register as a non-Hong Kong media. So there were 3 elements in the old times to identify the person as a journalist. And the first one, of course, is pretty obvious, but the two conditions come from the industry regulation. That is to say, if the journalism industry recognize a person doing journalism, then this person is considered a journalist. So the government then will also follow this identification as long as the industry recognize an individual as journalist. But with the amendment, now the power to identify journalists is shifted from industry to the government. So that amendment to the police general orders was very important because, as I said, the power to identify journalists was shifted from industry to the government or to the police. And it is a disadvantageous change to the emergence or the development of new media. Then next, I want to talk about the death of free media. My old title for this section is The Death of RTHK, but the death not only happened to RTHK, but to much other media as well. I prepared these slides starting from last week, and I have to change it again and again because I wanted to talk about RTHK last week, but now something else happened. I think you all know that Hong Kong Cable, which is an excellent TV station, has a very good news department. That department was removed, and a section chief was fired. The reason or the consequence of that move was that all the senior journalists decided to quit that station, Hong Kong Cable. So I changed my title to The Death of the Free Press, but I want to use RTHK as an example. In the industry, RTHK is a renowned and well-respected media. It received funding from the government, and all of its employees are government servants, but they public for the public interest. There is a show called Hong Kong Connection, produced by Cho Yuk-ling. I think many of you may know her. And Cho Yuk-ling was accused at the beginning of November. And the reason was that, well, in Hong Kong, you can go into the system and obtain the vehicle information to know the registration information, such as the owner of the car. So it's a very common practice in Hong Kong media. So Ms. Choi went to check that registration, but under the road traffic ordinance, there wasn't a purpose of such the obtaining of the vehicle information as reporting. Since there wasn't such a purpose in the ordinance, Ms. Choi needed to choose another purpose or another reason for checking this information. That's why she was accused. Then the government changed the law to forbid people from getting such vehicle information to report for public good, and that's why she was arrested. And Hong Kong Cable, in fact, is another event that just happened very recently. So the high-level management was shuffled, and the new management changed Hong Kong Cable's journalists, which is a very common practice when we see government trying to suppress the media. Next, I want to move on to the national security law. I think this is an express train to 2047. Well, the China's National People's Congress went into, passed this national security law at 11 p.m. on June 30 without the public having seen any of the provisions. And this damages the freedom of press in Hong Kong. we can see some articles which damage press freedom. For example, Article 10. The Hong Kong Special Administrative Region shall promote national security education in schools and universities and through social organizations, the media, the internet. I think the media and the internet are two key elements in this article because this means that the government can control the media or the internet if these two channels are promoting national security. Article 54, governments in Hong Kong and the Office of the Commissioner of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Hong Kong shall take necessary measures to strengthen the management of and services for organs of foreign countries and international organizations, which include international NGOs and international media. This article gives the Office of the Commissioner of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs a lot of power to control foreign organizations or foreign media. So the management used to be in the hands of the Hong Kong government, but with Article 54, this power has been handed over to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to Beijing, to put it simply. Article 29. A person who steals, spies, obtains with payments, or unlawfully provides state secrets or intelligence concerning national security shall be punished. Article 43 changes, or actually it relaxes the old regulations on surveillance. In the past, you have to go to the court to ask for a warrant to conduct the surveillance. However, Article 43 suggests that interception of communications and covert surveillance of persons suspected of committing crimes against national security requires only the consent of the chief executive and no longer requires court approval. 59. Any person who has information pertaining to an offense endangering national security under this law is obliged to testify truthfully. So these also impacted the journalist. When in court, the journalist can no longer claim that I need to protect the source of my information and therefore I refuse to testify. It's no longer workable. In the past, journalists could make that claim, but with the passage of the national security law, if this matter is concerning national security, then journalists can no longer claim that they have to protect their informants. So when there are 2 or 3 cases like this in the courts, then we can expect that there will almost be no people or no informants anymore who would like to share their information with the journalist. And then in succession, subversion of state power, and terrorism all include so-called instigation as an offense. So as long as a behavior is considered to be instigation, then it is an offense. And this charge may be brought about against the journalist. For example, the 2019 Financial Times case. Well, the Hong Kong Correspondents Club invited a person who calls for the independence of Hong Kong to give a speech. Is this invitation a form of instigation? Well, the National Security Council can make that determination. So these, in fact, damages the freedom of press a lot. Next, I want to talk about some foreign journalists who were expelled. In fact, starting from 2018, Beijing started use a visa as a way to expel foreign journalists. And since middle of 2020, people start to feel that there was unusual delay of the approval of visas. And that delay affected more than 10 journalists from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, Bloomberg, Reuters, and BBC. And Chris Buckley was one of the examples because his work visa was refused by Beijing. So he moved on to Australia to continue his work. Next, the right to work or the right to making interviews now become a bargain in political conflicts. The U.S.-China conflict continues to heat up, so visa become a weapon between the two powers. So China continues to revoke the press permit of some of its international journalists, banning them from covering news in the country, and such ban extended to non-U.S. media. So there were 2 Australian journalists, in fact, left China as if they were running away from disaster. They went into the Australian embassy and then they went back to Australia. And in 2020, the U.S. began to impose restrictions on Chinese organizations and journalists in the U.S. as well. The State Department defines official Chinese media such as Xinhua News Agency and People's Daily as foreign missions that are part of the Chinese government and limits the number of their employees. So what I want to stress here is that USA and China are using the right to journalism as a strategic tool or a weapon. As a professional association, this is not a benign direction for this industry. And I don't think we can compare China's behavior to USA's behavior because these are, in fact, slightly different. When China deals with right to journalism, Chinese governments always uphold this high level of discretion, and it's very unclear as to how the government decide who can cover the story and who cannot. And there are double standards as well. The Chinese government limits the press freedom of foreign journalists. However, it requires other governments that the Chinese media should have the right to cover the stories in international community.
So these are truly double standards. And I think in the Western world, they've mainly tolerated this kind of attitude from China. However, recently we've seen the United States take a stand. The United States will no longer accept this, and as a result, we have seen 2 countries almost at war when it comes to press freedom. This kind of outcome has been much more heightened tension across the 2 countries. We need to think about why we put up with double standards when it comes to China. I would like to emphasize once again that we do not want to see an escalation of tensions. However, we have to know that this is a two-way sword, and it could cut both ways. And this is a slide where we can see how visas, work permits for journalists from China and the United States have been affected. This is mainly for your reference. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that we are entering into a period of a new normal. The new normal is where Hong Kong will become more like Shanghai. What I mean is, starting from 2019, after we saw the passage of the national security law for Hong Kong, and we've seen a crackdown on press freedom, ultimately what the Chinese government is conveying is Hong Kong is just going to be another Chinese city or another Shanghai. So I really believe that when it comes to the future of Hong Kong, we are seeing a Hong Kong that used to have a superior judicial system and freedom of speech. Now it is being spiraling downwards where it is going to match that of China. And I think the national security law is an important tool to make that happen. I think the crackdown we're seeing now on reporters is actually a very small part of the overall strategy. This concludes my presentation today. I want to end with this photograph. This photograph was taken during one of the protests where we saw a policeman spraying pepper spray right at the face of a reporter. This journalist was one of our cameramen covering the protests in Hong Kong. So I think this photograph very clearly describes for us the role of reporters and their relationship with the police force during the recent protests in Hong Kong. Thank you.
好，那接下来我们应该是有
Yes, we will now begin the Q&A, and we welcome you to ask questions by raising your hand. Please press the button by the microphone in front of you to speak. A red light will go on to signal that your microphone is live. And when you are finished speaking, please press the button again to turn the microphone off.
I welcome all questions. I really hope that I can have a discussion with everyone. Any questions?
Would you mind if I asked you a question?
Please.
You had a very interesting and informative presentation just now. And one of the things that you highlighted was not only foreign journalists having their visas revoked as a consequence of the new national security law, but also how the local journalists in Hong Kong are also facing some challenges as well as personal risks in conducting their day-to-day work. So it seems that as the circumstances have evolved as such, that the news may become increasingly more singular, the voice of the news. I was wondering if you could share more insight with regards to how you foresee the media.
April asked a question about conditions for work in for local reporters. Honestly speaking, I'm not very optimistic about their future. I talked about several case studies for Hong Kong journalists and media. And a few of the challenges that I foresee is when it comes to cable TV, there are some long-term as well as short-term factors we need to keep in mind. For example, we can see that there is a problem faced by cable TV operators, which is they are losing revenue very rapidly. I think this is true for Taiwanese cable operators as well. So today, it doesn't matter which side of the pendulum you stand on, you are still suffering from loss of ad revenue. So you need to rely heavily on government subsidy. Unless you are a commercially driven media, you are getting some kind of subsidy from the Hong Kong government. And we are already seeing people in Hong Kong who are working for these cable TV operators or media being asked to take 2 days of leave, no pay, without being paid. And this is a part of the problem of not receiving adequate ad revenue. Another issue I need to highlight is that of COVID-19. I think the pandemic has also impacted the operations for many members of the media. If journalists in Hong Kong wanted to cover stories in China, they need to undergo 14 days of quarantine. And when they return to Hong Kong, they also have to go through another 14 days of quarantine. This is also additional cost that they need to consider. In addition, I think there is the issue of freedom of speech. In Hong Kong, when it comes to commercial media, or we can say media that's more pro-democracy or who are more liberal, many of their high-level managers have been changed. So we can see that the people who are replacing them usually come from very conservative media or people who are outsiders, people who are not trained journalists. Once these people have been swapped in, then there will be a trimming of the fat where there is a whole cost down initiative taking place. And a new breed of journalists are also being trained to cover news. So I think these are all structural changes that we are witnessing and is very worrying. Another thing that I would like to highlight is in Hong Kong, I think the Hong Kong radio station, RTHK, it is a very, very successful news media. However, when it comes to RTHK, there is one weakness. RTHK is actually a government-held media. All of them funding, all of the employees are government employees as well as being government funded. And very often in you will hear that Hong Kong government officials will criticize RTHK for not supporting the government. Today, if you are a state-owned media, it is a reporter's dream that you can still say what is on your mind and report objectively and put the public good at the forefront. However, today, if politicians come into the picture where they don't really care about the ethics or the principles of press freedom, the result is even in a media like RTHK, many of the programs that are being produced, if it has any criticism on the part of the Hong Kong government, they will run into trouble. It'll be hard to air, to get airtime. So in the future, I think we need to look at whether there will be some milestone events. What do I mean by milestone events? I mean that whether the Hong Kong national security law is going to be applied to the prosecution of journalists. Right now, we do not see the Hong Kong national security law being directly used on the prosecution of journalists. However, in the future, if a certain news article is going to be accused of violating the national security law, I think then this is definitely the beginning of the end, where we're seeing a terrible downward spiral in terms of standards.
So my question is, you mentioned that many foreign
我的问
journalists
题
tend
是
to
你有提到
have
外
their
国
visas
的
rejected
记
or
者
have
他们
some
常常
issues kind of
拿
getting
不到
into the
签
country. And so
证
I'm curious,
签证被
do
拒
you feel
绝
that foreign journalists
所以我
tend to be
很好奇
treated
的是
better than
你觉得
domestic journalists?
外
And
国
if
记者
so,
是不是
is
他们能
there
够得到的待
some
遇比当地的
possibility for
香港记
foreign
者要好一
journalists to
点？
use that
如果
kind of
是的
privilege
话，
to
外国记者可不
help
可以
support domestic
运用
journalists
这一
in
种
Hong
特殊
Kong
待
and
遇
in China
来
as
进一步的
as
支
well? I guess the
持
reason I
香
ask
港
this is
的
because I
记
think
者？我为什么要问这个问题
amongst
呢
the？kind of
因
expat
为
or foreign
我认为
community,
对于
the
很多
issues of
海外
freedom
人
of
士
speech，
我们
and
都非常关
I
心
suppose
香港的
protest
新闻自
security in
由，
Hong
而且
Kong
我们
are received
也
in a
能
very
够
varying way.
可能我们能不能够
Yeah,
上一
so that's my
些
question to
例
you.
？Sorry, I'm not able to completely capture your question.
Do foreign journalists tend to have more protection or more privilege in terms of protection from the state than domestic journalists? And if so, how do those protections help inform whether or not those foreign journalists can kind of use that privilege to help support domestic journalists in Hong Kong?
I think when it comes to foreign journalists, what they have an advantage on is some areas. And then there's also the problem for foreign journalists of applying for a work visa, because in Hong Kong, you need to often change your visa. And if, according to the Hong Kong government, you have touched the red line or they feel that you're a problematic journalist, they can revoke that. So I think for foreign journalists, this is a huge restriction. For any journalist, when you're living as an expat in a different country, you may have rented a place, you put down roots, and suddenly you need to leave and uproot overnight.
Just like the journalist from Financial Times, he was not able to return to Hong Kong and needed to rely on other people to help him deal with this process. So everything you do may change because your visa is revoked. And that is the biggest weakness to foreign journalists. However, foreign journalists may not need to face the risks, physical risks, or risks to their safety like domestic journalists. I think that's the advantage foreign journalists may have. But I also need to point out that when covering stories in China, what tend to happen was the journalists from foreign countries didn't have any issues, but the assistants who tended to be Chinese or locals, or the interviewees who were Chinese, may face some problems, like the incident of Li Wangyang. That was an example. So Li Wangyang was a social activist and a foreign journalist, went to China to interview Mr. Li. And the journalist went back to Hong Kong. But Mr. Li then died for reasons that was unknown. So people started to wonder whether or not Mr. Li was murdered in some unknown way because he took the interview with a foreign journalist. If you look at national security law, many of the charges have wording such as if you collude with foreigners, with foreign parties. So if you talk to a foreign journalist, this person may consider to be colluding with foreign powers. So foreign journalists may have a high level of freedom in working on certain issues, but that freedom is not that large to allow them to cover any stories they want. I think we have 3 more minutes. I wonder whether there are any other questions. Okay, maybe 2 over there or 3 over there. Please state your question respectively, and I will give a collective answer. Thank you very much for your speech. My question is, when we see media in China face worse situation now, they tend to come to Taiwan to restart their operations. So I wonder how Taiwan can provide a more open environment for these media who came to Taiwan so that they can continue with their job.
Taiwan perspective into the discussion. Specifically, I am interested in understanding what policy mechanisms could be deployed by Taiwanese authorities to support journalists currently based in Hong Kong for the sake of maintaining free and fair coverage of not only China but also the broader region.
委员您好。 我想问一下委员这个问
Hi,
题，
I have a
我们
question.
知道中国大陆以及对岸，他们其实对人民的所谓言
We
论自由
understand that mainly China has a lot of restrictions on freedom of speech, so freedom of press is even further restricted. So when it comes to local media or foreign media in China, shouldn't they respect such restrictions imposed by the Chinese government? Okay, let me start with your question. Here's my view of the media. Now, we are at an international conference, which is organized by RSF, Reporters Without Borders. So my perspective of media is that this is a line of work that works without the borders. So we have media from Russia, Kashmir, and other countries. The reason why there is no border is because we think journalists share a common understanding of freedom of speech. That is the consensus. Of course, governments may have different kinds of restrictions on media. But we're seeing that governments around the world have a certain level of consensus on media. So the wording may appear to be similar in the Chinese law, in Hong Kong's law, in other countries' law. So I think the point is not whether or not we all have the same values, but that when these values are implemented, can we respect the spirit that are embedded in the spirits? And I think that would be the largest extent of the so-called freedom of speech. If we think this government is able to respect freedom of speech, with that understanding, then we can start to talk about different restrictions in different countries. For example, if I'm in the States, I want to cover in Washington, D.C., in White House, I have to register first. I cannot just barge in and report on the story. And I follow this rule imposed on journalists who want to cover the stories in White House is because I respect the rule imposed by the USA media. And the other two questions are related to the situation in Taiwan. I think there are a lot of things the Taiwanese government can do during the discussion panel. I think we have more time to talk on those things. But I think currently some laws and regulations can be amended to allow more freedom for media to come to Taiwan. Because currently there is so much red tape, and the red tape has to be cut down. Also, we need to make Taiwan open enough so that in Taiwan, some information or detailed information regarding China and Hong Kong can be obtained. As long as the elites or the communities in Taiwan encourage this kind of flow of information, then I think this kind of flow will attract international journalists who are interested in covering the regions which speak Mandarin Chinese. Regarding details of policies and so on, I think we can save it from the discussion panel. Thank you very much.
Our second keynote speech today will address the issue of journalism in the post-COVID era. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Eva Tang, the CEO of Media Watch.
Good afternoon, all. I apologize for my presentation in Taiwan official language because, my Chinese is much better than English, so. 好，谢谢大家。好，
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the organizer for your invitation so that I can talk about this topic. My background is not media. My background, in fact, is NGO. For the past 20 years, I've worked on human rights. More than 10 years ago, I started to join work related to self-regulation in the journalism and industry. And currently, this year, in fact, I just joined this Media Watch. So I want to thank the organizer again for being brave enough to invite me to come to talk about this topic. And I look forward to some more discussions with you. Now, I work on the right to health, right to work when it comes to human rights, especially for the disadvantaged or underprivileged minorities. So part of my work is about public health. So I try to combine my past experience on public health news about health, and then move on to talk about some of my observations in Taiwan regarding journalism in the post-COVID era. I think information or the dissemination of information has become more important than ever in the pandemic. It's really difficult to calculate the speed of the dissemination. We know there are some closed communities. They have secretive ways of spreading the news in closed groups or communities. Of course, there is influence of that kind of dissemination, but it's hard to calculate that kind of speed. And second thing is discrepancies in media literacy makes it easier for false information to spread. About 10 or 20 years ago, if you go to FDA's website, you will be able to see a popular page about Line. Line is an instant messaging application, and the elderly tend to send and resend false information through these applications. And that kind of false information is also seen in pandemic because people send messages about if you eat this, then you will not be infected. But FDA has had a page to clarify the misinformation regarding health. But on other issues, on management of the pandemic and so on, there isn't so much clarification. So sometimes it's really difficult to discern which media is legitimate media. When I was a student, it was easy to tell who was from the media, like what Mr. Lee said. If a journalist has an ID from the Correspondents Association, you can tell that this is a person from the media. But nowadays, this is difficult to tell who's from the media, and even more difficult to tell who is a journalist. And plus, people do not have high enough media literacy, which makes it more difficult to discern misinformation or disinformation. Now, with the advancement of technology, specific groups sometimes are targeted with specific messages. On this issue, some agencies are already researching on whether some information regarding China is disseminated in a certain way. And there was a media which was penalized because it spreaded disinformation regarding China, or these media spreads disinformation regarding the political circles in Taiwan. So specific groups are sometimes targeted with these kind of messages thanks to technologies. And there are new platforms of audio, video, and social media. People can use text to look for misinformation. But when this information is provided in the form of video and audio, it's really difficult to spot or to analyze. Another issue is the net roots are fueling disinformation, and they infiltrate into so much media. It's hard to tell what is truly public opinion and what is not. And when participants or when people talk about some issues online, does it mean that there are actual or real individuals behind those internet accounts? We don't know. And corruptive capital exist not only in authoritarian regimes. I think it may also exist in democratic regimes. Another issue is Google, Facebook, and so on, whether or not these online giants can take more social responsibilities and help discern what information is false. In fact, Facebook commission the fact-checking center to do the fact-check. But Facebook itself should take some social responsibility, or it simply does this because it wants to appear to be compliant with the Taiwanese laws without better internal mechanism. And we did some survey on the media credibility, and compared to 2014, the media credibility is dropping. And if the full mark is 10, the current credibility of the media is 5.58, 5.57, and it's still declining. And the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism also did a study, and Taiwan ranked the bottom three, one of the bottom three, which has the worst media credibility. So we're seeing the credibility continues to drop.
If we look at a study undertaken by Oxford University, we can see that when it comes to news relating to the pandemic, people still believe traditional news media. Also, Ofcom did a survey where they showed that BBC was very, very trusted when it came to relevant news. And for Taiwan, when you look at our public TV news station, it was regarded as the most reliable source of COVID-19 related news. In terms of selecting news related to the pandemic and that news that is not related to the pandemic, we can see that in general, people, when it comes to COVID-related coverage, they tend to believe traditional media over social media news platforms. However, at the same time, we know that there is a serious problem of fake news. And on many social media platforms, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So this is partly why people believe more in traditional media when it comes to COVID-19 coverage. So this is something that is quite encouraging for traditional news media. However, it's probably going to be quite short-lived. We're not sure whether this is going to continue or be sustainable in the future. In terms of sources of information about public health or the pandemic, we know that fear-mongering is the biggest industry. Many often people just report without fact-checking. It's very important to have better investigation. However, because people are consumed by fear, people want immediate information or news coverage. People are impatient for news. This kind of desire makes it much more easy for disinformation and misinformation to be rampant. The quicker the dissemination, the greater the fear. So with digital technology, we can see that information spreads very quickly. If we look at SARS and COVID-19 and compare the two periods, we can see whether we're talking about WHO or other international organizations, they are able to report on cases, confirmed cases, much quicker than during the SARS period. However, this has also resulted in the quicker spread of fake news. So when we are seeing technology work so readily, and fear-mongering being a very big industry, what do we do to ensure accurate information? Another issue we need to look at is the issue of China. We can see that many organizations related to public health are regarded as an important source of COVID-19 related information. And when it comes to developing countries or developed or countries that have fewer medical resources, they really rely heavily on the WHO for information. However, the role that China has played in this pandemic has resulted in people not really listening to the WHO. For example, in terms of mask wearing, Biden has just announced his new candidate for public health, and he is insisting that everybody needs to go back to wearing their masks. We know that in Taiwan, this is not an issue, although our former presenter, Mr. Lee, did not wear his mask, but he will probably get into serious trouble with our health minister, because starting from December 1st for Taiwan, you are going to be fined if you do not wear a mask. Actually, even when you go to a bar, you're required to wear a mask. So how do you wear a mask and drink? That remains to be seen. But in Taiwan, we are seeing that even with a lot of people getting sources of information from the WHO, there's still other actors who are influencing whether people comply or not. So this inconsistency is also an issue, I think, for reporters today. Today, what can we do to make sure that we provide speedy as well as accurate information and news? We know the importance of getting speedy information to the public during a pandemic, but making a mistake may have even greater repercussions. We may end up costing lives. For example, we know that in Italy, this was a problem. So should we be more conservative and make sure that our information is accurate? I think we can look at what medical journals are doing. If you look at JAMA, Lancet, or BMJ, these very well-known international medical journals, they now have a dedicated homepage that reports on COVID-19. But the papers on these websites are not considered as official medical papers. So they are able to be made available very quickly and publicly. However, its accuracy remains to be seen. And today, many medical papers have been put on the web page and then taken down the next day. We can also see that there is a lot of different interpretations of what's coming up. Does this count as fake news? Not really. Is it misinformation? It wasn't intended as misinformation, but the problem is what is being recorded as accurate today may not be accurate tomorrow. So when top-notch medical journals already encountered this predicament, we can imagine that when it comes to the media, when we're disseminating information, there are many, many side effects we need to keep in mind. There is a lot of misinformation, misunderstanding, and misleading information, and this is going to be very problematic. I also want to talk about the role of the government in all this. Can the government in the end become the most reliable source of pandemic-related information? I think for any human rights advocate, we generally do not trust government information when it comes to other issues. However, during this pandemic, we have seen that people are waiting to hear what the government has to say. I will talk a little bit about Taiwan's experience. What happens to the media when the government becomes the most trusted source of information? I also want to talk a little bit about SARS in 2003 and COVID-19. In 2003, we were facing a presidential election. President Chen Shui-bian was hoping to be re-elected, and Mr. Lian Zhan was the KMT candidate. And at the time, many people liked the mayor of Taipei, who was a KMT member, a great deal. So at the time, it was a very tight election where the two political parties had very divergent views when it came to how we need to control the pandemic. Very often, the central government would make an announcement about how to curb SARS, and the local government would do something completely different. At the time, there were many news articles about the difference between the central government and the local government. However, during the COVID-19 period, we know that the central government and the local government have been in alignment. And COVID-19 is also regarded as the China virus. And this has meant that people have unified in Taiwan due to our dislike of China. So people have unified in their actions. And the ruling party, as well as our president, is receiving unprecedented support. So we know that public opinion is the main reason for this difference between the two periods. In addition, in 2003, even though we had some laws relating to the control of infectious diseases, however, we did not have a very single chain of command between central government and the local governments. But today, there is a very integrated, unified chain of command where we have a central command center. This has meant that local governments are not allowed to unilaterally report on something. For example, Zhanghua is a county in Taiwan where they were penalized for issuing news without the approval of our central government. So I think when it comes to COVID-19, Taiwan is entering an era of big government. And this is, of course, also a challenge for the media in Taiwan. In addition, I mentioned in 2003, it was a different era in terms of technology. Today, we are even further when it comes to technological advancement. So if you go onto the CDC webpage, you will be able to see very timely information. So media today, they don't need to go to interview doctors at a special hospital. They only need to follow CDC's news or CDC information. In terms of coverage of news, in 2003, I mentioned that because of the presidential election, we saw that there was a kind of competition between the two political parties. So at the time, many journalists were covering stories in hospitals or where there were incidents. No journalists would stay in the press office in a government ministry, but that has changed a great deal. In 2020, what we are seeing is everybody just goes to ministries and CDC, and they will attend each one of the CDC press conferences, or they will go to our executive branch to learn everything there is to know about Taiwan's efforts in controlling the pandemic. This has resulted in a shrinking of local news reporting. But even when it counts as local news, we can see that it's being actually covered centrally.
In a way, it restricts what the journalists can cover. In the past, in the SARS period, journalists went to interview bus driver and different people as to how they fight against SARS. But now the news or the content of news has become quite consistent. TV news and the media on the internet and so on. There are hundreds of media outlets in Taiwan, but the content of their information regarding the pandemic is 90% the same. Has it anything to do with the law regarding the infectious disease? I think to some extent, because if a person disseminates false information, it is punishable under this law. But what is false information? Maybe no one can really define that. And the society now is looking at media from a different perspective. In the past, the media represent people to monitor the government, but now media is being monitored by the public. Because of the big government in pandemic, because of the special regulation on the to govern the infectious disease, because of desire to have accurate news. And we do not really know how to, cover the stories on our own. So populism is on the rise, and people may have some doubt regarding policies that damage human rights. For example, if a spouse is from China and the other party, the marriage, is a Taiwanese, can the children from this marriage come to Taiwan, or can the children of the spouse from mainland China can come to Taiwan? Well, legally, there were different policies and there were disputes, of course. So that would be a challenge in 2020. And also, it seems that media this year, media has made a lot of progress, and their news have become a lot more accurate. So these opinions are given by an X group. So I think you can think about what these opinions or what these remarks mean. So next, I want to talk about whether we should go fast or go accurate when we cover a story. Well, some TV stations created fact-checking centers, but for independent media or smaller media, it is very likely that they do not have the resources to do fact-checking. Also, when covering press conferences organized by the government, maybe the journalists are not able to do fact-checking. So if journalists think that the government cannot be a reliable source of information, well, the media's responsibility is always to doubt or to challenge the government. But now that the journalists are getting the information from the government, so fact-checking becomes extremely difficult. There's another difficulty because journalists may have some problems understanding specific issues. The journalist may have a mile-wide knowledge on something, but that knowledge is only 1 inch deep. But the expert have the other way around. They have an inch-wide knowledge, but that knowledge goes 1 mile deep. So journalists can cover a story with this 1 inch width of knowledge, but under this kind of circumstances, experts, sometimes they're experts in lying. So experts can also be extremely trained, liars. So who are the experts on certain issues? Can the media find true experts? And when experts talk about an issue, are their remarks influenced by the government? Because it's likely that the government has gathered a group of experts, and the government has gathered all the experts in Taiwan on a certain issue. So if some other people, some other experts have a different opinion, they may not publicly express what worries they have regarding government policies. So since the experts are not criticized openly, they may interpret the issues with the government's intention. So public opinion in the past may attack these experts. But when the media want to find experts who have a different opinion, they're not able to reach the experts who are willing to state their opposition publicly. And in Article 14 of the Special Act for Prevention, Relief, and Revitalization Measures for Severe Pneumonia with Novel Pathogens, there is an article that punishes the act of disseminating false information or rumors. So media may conduct self-censorship. So the censorship no longer comes only from outside, but from inside the media as well. Some media have been warned. They have not been penalized yet, but some have indeed been warned. And also, prevention and combating misinformation about the pandemic may be used as an excuse for the government to clamp down on press freedom. Now, another issue is, the government itself may be the largest media platform. It has Facebook page, line groups, and so on. And now, when they organize press conference, they no longer need TV stations or broadcasting services. They can broadcast press conference through online platforms. That's why the government now has already become the largest media platform. That's why the government doesn't have to rely on other media as it did before. So, is the media still the messenger for the government? Because with a big government, the media is only relaying the messages to others. Does it still have the power to interpret the news? I think this is another issue. And Mr. Lee also mentioned the right to work, the labor rights, and health rights as well. Well, Media Watch and other organizations did a survey, and we know that some journalists are attacked because of their stories. So on a scale of 5, the satisfaction level among the journalists regarding their job is only 1 point something, which is quite low. And the journalists are not trained by the government or by professional organizations on what the principles they should follow and what boundaries shall never be crossed. There isn't such professional training. But and of course, when journalists cover the pandemic, they may face a risk of not having enough protective gears. Journalists themselves have to find their own masks. So there isn't much labor rights and health rights for the journalists. during the pandemic, the journalists and have to cover the story at night. They'd go to the airport in order to cover stories about people who have been infected. So they work overnight. So this is especially serious in smaller media. There isn't enough protection for the journalists. So I think journalists who cover health issues face their own health issues. Also, I want to talk about the fact that some media is bullied. Many journalists are attacked or bullied. And in the streaming or the online press conference organized by the government, we see that journalists are bullied, have been bullied, and some companies have bring this issue up to the government that the government need to help stop the bullying of the media. And after the pandemic, the media may need to transform, and 80% of the news right now is about the pandemic, what sanitizers, what masks there are, and choosing what to cover and what to not will decide how a media is going to develop. And due to the pandemic, the circulation of the news is going down. So maybe more and more media will go digital instead of going physical. Next, I think the society needs to think about whether we want to spend more time monitoring the media or more time on monitoring the government. When the public is paying more attention to the media, of course, this is a good thing. But if we're seeing the media as a thief, or if we're seeing this is an era where when we cannot criticize the government, then maybe public opinion is used to limit freedom of press, which I think is a pity. So I think this is a quote from Ms. Cho, who also worked in Media Watch. So I think we need to do better news in a worse time. And journalists stand at the front line of the media, and journalists are particularly alert to the historical gatekeeping mission, which is not only to guard the achievements of the good work the government has been doing, but also to ensure that we do not forget to anchor the society in a chaotic time. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Ms. Tan, in your presentation, you talk about fact-checking. And a while back, I think Taiwan has a fact-checking center. It's very active in Facebook and other online platforms. There are also the bots, the chat bots in the line application that can be used to clarify the rumors. So there are some, I wonder whether there are some fact-checking programs by the governments due to the pandemic. Because there used to be a lot of activity, but not so much now.
Thank you for your question. Indeed, we signed our center, fact-checking center, signed a contract with Facebook so that we can help with a lot of fact-checking work and also provide feedback to Facebook. I mentioned in my presentation, we need to ask whether this is sufficient, because even when we have a fact-checking center, I think Facebook and Twitter, they also need to assume the responsibility of fact-checking. This needs to be done ahead of a post being made public on Facebook rather than only doing fact-checking after the fact. You asked also the question about whether we have a official fact-checking organization. As far as I know, no. And I think part of the reason is because CDC is now the voice of God in a way. Whatever CDC says, everybody stands by that. I can cite an example. There was a journalist from a traditional media who attended a CDC press conference, and he asked a very important question. He asked whether there was community infection in Taiwan. This is a very important question. Should you ask it? Of course, this should be asked. Perhaps he didn't ask the question in the most respectful way, but he was bullied. Even though this was a very important question, people said, "Are you looking down on Taiwan by asking this question?" He was seen as a troublemaker. So this makes us wonder, is it wrong to query the so-called facts? Perhaps the government isn't telling a lie per se, but they may also not be telling the complete truth. So what kind of role can journalists play when there is big government? I think Taiwan has done really well in fighting the pandemic, and we have very high compliance on the part of our citizens. And as a result, fact-checking, I think, is no longer regarded as that important. And also, another example I can cite came from a traditional media journalist. He raised the question that online, there's been some rumor that if you look at your tongue, you will be able to tell whether someone has COVID-19. And before CDC even answered this question, this press conference that was being streamed already had many comments where people were criticizing the journalist asking this question. Are you an idiot? What's your IQ? Why are you asking such a stupid question? But actually, this is a valid question because the reporter knows that online many elderly people are spreading rumors about looking at somebody's tongue to know whether they have COVID-19. This is a way of checking a fact. So if it is fake, maybe it's very important for the government to make a clarification. However, people didn't really care about the clarification. Rather, everybody turned against the journalist, criticizing the journalist for asking a stupid question. So your question about facts, what is truth, what is accurate? I think right now in Taiwan, when it comes to pandemic reporting, we know that it is actually very consistent with what CDC has made public. Unlike Washington Post and New York Times, where they have their own fact-checking organization or center, I think in Taiwan we definitely need something like this. There's a lady at the back and then the gentleman in the middle. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. You mentioned that in 2003, during the SARS pandemic, because of the presidential elections and the rivalry between the two main political parties, so the media was able to provide reporting that was different from what the central government was saying. And if we contrast that with today, we can see that you're not allowed to do that. Is this because our media is really being manipulated by the political landscape? The second question I'd like to ask is, a lot of reporters are being bullied. Why do our citizens choose to believe the government over journalists? I think let me get all the questions in one go and I'll answer them together. You mentioned that journalists are being bullied. Can you talk about the origin of that behavior? Is there something historic? Is there a reason? why media or reporters is being bullied. I think this question is very hard to answer. I think when we're in an info war, we understand that fake news spreads really quickly. And precisely because it is 30% true, 70% fake, meaning that it's not completely false. People who are well educated know this, that you probably won't be able to tell who's completely telling lies. It's very, very difficult to ascertain. So, because it's a compilation, it's very easy then to bully the media. Is there manipulation behind the scenes? I think there is probably some political manipulation, but not all of it. I think there's also cyber warriors, cyber attacks. For example, if an official account for a government organization or a government ministry and a spokesperson for this ministry will probably have to see a fan base of 800, 900 people, of which probably many are just cyber warriors who are meant to go against a lot of media criticism. So is this being financially motivated, or is it the government that's arranged for some people to be in the group, or is it from manipulation from the other side? We do not have facts supporting what the composition is. But perhaps in the panel discussion, we can talk a little bit more about this, where it's important for the media to disclose certain things. For example, the government should make transparent, have they been paying for certain media coverage? I can cite another example. We have some public health ministries that are asking PR companies to run their web page. And you will see that this is something that was, of course, also controversial. One of the questions relating to the SARS period, what I would like to say in response to that question is, because of the presidential election at the time, there was serious rivalry between the KMT and the DPP. During that time, people were not so anti-China as they are right now. So national identity, I think in 2003, it wasn't the hot topic that it is today. Right now, I don't think it's because of political affiliation that people are now more in line with the CDC. Rather, I think it's because with COVID-19, after CDC was established, everybody began to look to CDC for guidance and leadership. And if you are going to query what the government is doing to control the pandemic, it's very easy for people to be labeled pro-China. So very often in the actual coverage, it's easy to be labeled as a pro-China advocate. And this is against public opinion in Taiwan right now. And this is another reason why a lot of the reporting is very uniform right now. Why do why does the general public trust the government over the media? That was another question that was raised. I think when it comes to news about the pandemic, if we look overseas, many people maybe have a sense of distrust for the government. But in Taiwan, people feel that they can see firsthand information from the CDC. They feel that that is the newest, most up-to-date information. And this is part of the reason for the appeal of the CDC. Also, due to legal constraints, we have certain requirements about media reporting. So sometimes for people, it's just much more convenient to go straight to the government CDC than try and differentiate for themselves which media they should trust. So I think this is partly why people tend to believe the government more. I think in 2023, the situation may be reversed because post-pandemic, I think we can observe whether in the next few months you are going to see more and more dissent when it comes to what the central government is advocating, be it wearing the mask, be it tracing, contact tracing. All of these issues are going to generate more and more query because people's fears are subsiding. People now have more time and more brain or headspace to think about, are these policies actually good for me? So I think a lot of this has to do with the decrease or increase of people's fears. I think I still have 2 minutes. Hello. My question is related to media literacy. And I think the high school period is very critical in nurturing media literacy. So today, if you were designing the curriculum for high schoolers, what 3 things would you insist on having to incorporate to make sure that high schoolers have the proper media literacy? Is my colleague Ren Hao in the audience? If I don't cover all the important points, I would like him to also answer this question. Right now, we actually have a special dedicated group working with the Ministry of Education on media literacy. It's also important when it comes to teacher training to teach teachers about media literacy. Not only are high schoolers very important, and every year there are important summer camps on media literacy for high schoolers, and after every camp, many high schoolers want to become journalists, and we always ask them to think carefully about the consequences. But we're actually even looking at younger students, looking at students in elementary school and even younger. We know just as cultural literacy, media literacy needs to be started very early. Many primary school students are taught to differentiate between fake news, to do fact-checking. But many of them actually don't even watch TV. They get all of their content on their cell phones. They are more interested in becoming YouTubers or KOLs. So they are much more influenced by social media. So I think in the future, when we talk about self-media and media literacy, we need to have a different approach. How can we teach media literacy to this new generation who are digital natives? How do they nurture media literacy? In our new curriculum, we are already targeting this. However, I think we need to do more because we need to think about what kind of media literacy is most pertinent. Also, who is eligible to teach me? I think who is considered the expert? Is it a journalist, or is it who is the right person to teach us about media literacy? So I think when it comes to education, there is so much to think about, but right now the Ministry of Education still has some work to do. Thirdly, what resources can I utilize when it comes to media literacy? This is something that I really think the Ministry of Education can do more on.
Thank you, Eva.
Thank you very much.
We will now have a break. Please join us again at 3:15. And a reminder to not leave valuables in the hall. Thank you. Thank you for joining us again. As a board member of RSF Taiwan chapter, it is my privilege to be the moderator for today's panel discussion to explore what role democratic governments should play in defending press freedom worldwide. I would now like to invite our guest panelists onto the stage. We have Mr. Cedric Aviani, Head of Reporters Without Borders East Asia Bureau. Mr. Zhi Li, member of the Standing Committee at the Association of Taiwan Journalists. Ms. Eva Tang, CEO of Media Watch. Mr. Wu Erkai-shi, Emeritus Board Member of Reporters Without Borders and Deputy Secretary General of the Taiwan Parliamentary Human Rights Commission. So first of all, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining our panel discussion today. Historically, we've attributed a lack of press freedom to authoritarian regimes. However, we have increasingly bore witness to verbal attacks as well as policies endangering journalists and press freedom from democratic governments as well. I would like to first begin with Cedric and ask what your thoughts are on the role of democratic governments.
Well, thank you, April. Well, what we can say is that the lines are totally blurred. On one side, the side of the democracies, the equation is supposedly simple. We've got the public delegating their powers to elected representatives. And because human is human, representatives will have a tendency to abuse this power that was delegated to them if they have an opportunity. So actually the ideal role of the press is to deter this temptation of abuse. On the other side, we've got authoritarian regimes in which it's more clear. The Chinese regime is currently very actively promoting this as a countermodel. The media are at the service of the state to support the state's development.
Thank
and
you for
the
joining
public
us again.
is supposed
As a
to
board member
agree
of RSF
with the
Taiwan chapter,
state's
it is my
decision,
privilege
which are
for
supposed to
today's
be
panel
good
discussion
and in the
to
public's
explore what role
interest per
democratic
se.
governments should play
So this is
in defending
the,
press freedom worldwide.
I would say
I
normal
would now like to
definition,
invite our
and
guest
recently we
panelists
see more
onto
and
the
more
stage.
in
We have Mr.
democracies
Cedric Aviani,
very
Head of
violent
Reporters Without Borders
attacks
East
on
Asia
the media.
Bureau.
Of course, everyone would think of former President Donald Trump, but not only. In many countries, in Europe,
Mr.
in France,
Zhi Li,
in
member
Hungary,
of the Standing
in
Committee
Poland,
at the Association
all around
of
the
Taiwan
world, there have been
Journalists.
increasing attacks on the media by representatives of the people, and this makes it very complicated, of course,
Ms. Eva Tang,
for
CEO of Media
democracies
Watch.
to try and promote the idea of freedom of the press in the world, because how can they do this when
Mr.
they're not
Wu
an
Erkai-shi,
exemplar?
Emeritus Board Member of Reporters Without Borders
Right, I think
and
Cedric
Deputy
brings up a great
Secretary
point,
General of the
with
Taiwan
regards
Parliamentary
to,
Human Rights
there
Commission.
being increasingly more crackdowns on the press.
Zhi, I was wondering what your insight would be with regards to self-censorship.
我觉得对媒体来讲，我觉得自我审查可
For
能来
media,
自
I
两
think
个方面。我觉
self-censorship
得
comes from two
一方面
places.
是这个公司的
First,
因为
the
商业媒体
media,
的
the company
特
itself,
性，
is
所
a
以你必
commercial
须要
entity.
去不能讲必须，
So
你就
you
可
have
能去
to,
传
well,
达
not to say you have to, but you have to know what your boss likes. I think that's one reason for self-censorship. In different places, be it a authoritarian regime or a democracy, more or less, you see certain level of self-censorship. I think that's one form of self-censorship. The second reason for self-censorship is from the environment, is from the external force. We talked a lot about Hong Kong and the events over there in 2019. And RSF, throughout the years, has been paying attention to countries with low degree of freedom of press. And when it comes to self-censorship, in those countries, I think it's really difficult to fight against because you are living inside this structure. Unless you have a high level of self-awareness, unless you understand that you're going to pay for what you want to do to fight against censorship. Otherwise, it's really difficult to combat censorship or self-censorship. So I think when facing these journalists who face self-censorship, we need international supports like from RSF or other network participants. Through this international ranking, through a good network, through deeper understanding of the situation of journalists around the countries and expose these stories, then we may be able to help the media or the journalist to combat self-censorship. I think that would be the best form of support for them.
Right. And earlier, Eva had mentioned perhaps there's an influx of corrupt money. And I was wondering what your perspective is with regards to what role government should play in trying to mitigate that.
Right. Corrosive capital was seen a lot in authoritative regime. But in fact, in the democratic countries, we do see that political leaders attack the media sometimes. So I think there are three things that the democracies should do. The first thing is transparency and accountability. We need to ask the media to make public where their funding is from and who their shareholders are. In Taiwan, we know there's a CTI TV, but other media should also make public what or where their funding is from. I think Liberty Times or China Times should also make that disclosure. And transparency and accountability should be what the government need to disclose as well. Does the government pay for the media? Does it work with any media? As long as people can manipulate media, the government, it is one of the possible stakeholders to manipulate media. So we need to know what kind of information from the government is paid for and what is truly covered by the media. Second, I think search engines such as Safari, Google, and Facebook, Twitter, Line, YouTube, and so on should take their social responsibilities, especially the search engines. Some people may pay to get better results or to generate better search results, but with or without payment, these search engines need to follow certain ethical principles. So this kind of social responsibility should be added on top of accountability and transparency. This should be requirements in democracies too. Thank you.
Right. It sounds like Eva has mentioned transparency, accountability, and also in providing a sort of incentive in order to entice those businesses to adhere to a moral and ethical code. What are your thoughts on that, Kai-shi?
When we enter the 21st century, we would expect all the ethic code that has guided the media and government, the relation between media and government and audience, general recipient of the information, would evolve into a newer, higher standard. But of course, the older code, such as a high wall and sacred wall between, let's say, boardroom and newsroom, should be elevated, but at the same time, in the media, that's what media outfit, and then within the government, the transparency, the government have to have a not only self-restraint, but also it should become a norm. It should become even a norm that the public expect government to be transparent. The norm should be strong enough to push their elected officials to pass on laws to make sure to enforce that transparency. But the 21st century is a very rapidly developing time when it comes to media, when it comes to, let's say, it defines media altogether from the very beginning. Twitter phenomena that has changed the relation between media and the audience and recipient of information. And the recipient of information become the generator of information. And the government is being scrutinized by not only the traditional media, but also the so-called new media. So the new norm, there is a new norm need to be established, but we are not catching up fast enough. What we can see is the law has been trying to pass and regulating the government, but we do not have enough law to regulate this mighty, powerful, newly emerged force state. But when you if you try to regulate this new force state, you are also trying to push your hand into people's freedom, because the so-called force state at this time is also belong to the people, because they are the generator of information. So at this time, I think one of the important role the government should play is to assemble discussion from the government perspective, but also from the people's perspective. You should include the legislators, you should include experts in media freedom, but other than just upholding the freedom of information flow, we should also regulate it. And then I praise RSF's strong position in this, that regulation is not a dirty word when in the 21st century. It's a very, very much needed and delayed phenomena. So, but how to do that? I think we need a strong debate among ourselves.
Right. I think Kai-shi is right. With regards to media regulations, it definitely is a very sensitive topic. And Eva had mentioned in her presentation earlier that oftentimes when there are regulations, not per se, but other forms of outspoken words that could be labeled as being pro-China, perhaps. I wonder what your thoughts might be on that, 志德。
什么样的情况会说上心里的话被贴上 pro-China 的标签？
Not at all. I was just thinking if you were earlier just talking about the Hong Kong new national security law and how that has impacted Hong Kong journalists. And I was wondering with regard to media regulations, a topic that has come to the forefront in the recent news cycle, if there is any relevance.
好，我这样子说，这个问题很困难。
This is a very difficult question to
因为
answer.
规范
Because
刚才其实
regulation,
在场外的访问里面，其实
I think when
也
I
有人
was
谈到
interviewed
这个
outside the
规范的
room,
问题。
I was also asked this question about regulation.
在谈论中天的这件事情。
I think in Taiwan right now, this is a very hot issue because of CTI TV. And in Taiwan, everybody feels that it's quite an ambiguous issue. This is how I view the issue. I think first we need to look at how the law is arrived at. Was it through a democratic process? Does it follow democratic principles? If we look at the Hong Kong national security law, during the passage of the law, we knew that it was established under very dubious circumstances. And the People's Assembly in China, of course, they have a right to pass a law. But when it comes to Hong Kong, we know that the people of Hong Kong should have their basic rights protected. Therefore, when it comes to the passing of any legislation, you need to first go through the Hong Kong legislature. If you understand the Hong Kong government system, you will know that Article 23 of the Basic Law emphasizes the importance of consulting Hong Kong when it comes to security issues. It's up to the people of Hong Kong to decide whether they want something related to security. They should be in the driver's seat. So this is something that the Hong Kong legislature is well aware of. However, with the passing of the national security law, we have seen that it was passed through undemocratic means and forced down the throats of the people of Hong Kong. So when we see that the law itself and the way that it was passed was not through democratic processes, then I think it's very difficult to ask people to follow the law. So that's the first concern. And the second concern is if we're going to talk about CTI TV, I think it's important to understand that it is not a violation, I think, of people's basic rights. It does not infringe on freedom of speech either, in my mind. Because today, if we can protect the interests of the so-called media tycoons, I think that kind of freedom is different from that where everybody's freedom is improved. And what we really want to pursue is when everybody's freedom is protected. We hope that through legislation or regulation, we are able to stop any kind of monopolization. So I do not think that the CTI TV movement is one in the name of freedom. So ultimately, we need to ask ourselves, what we are doing, is it going to improve the overall degree of freedom? Only then, I think, we can say that this is the kind of freedom of speech that we are pursuing.
In order to enable the citizenry to have the information to guide them in their civic duties. Cedric? Oh, of course. Please, Kai-shi.
Just following up on Zhide's point, that we, being a democracy activist for 3 decades, one thing I have learned is how do we define freedom. Freedom is not a positive term. It should be passive. Freedom from oppression, freedom from deprivation. So, and then in RSF, the freedom of information is freedom from deprivation of information. Like we should be able to receive all the information. That is kind of that is the freedom. If we are Reporter Without Borders wants to defend, I think that is much more. That is in an equal, in a universal way. So, in order to protect that freedom, in order to defend the freedom of receiving information, we should, of course, protect the source of freedom. We should also protect the rights of the fourth estate that can broadcast, that can give away information, but in order, again, to defend the universal freedom of receiving the information. If we got that basic things right, and then to look at CTI event, CTI matter, I think we can get a much clearer perspective. But that can also extend to all other freedoms that we enjoy in this society.
Thank you, Kai-shi. And Cedric?
Yeah, I totally agree with Kai-shi. If I'm the strongest, I don't need laws. I do what I want. So what are laws made for in the beginning? They are made for protecting the weakest so that the society can work together. Of course, this definition is being perverted by authoritarian regimes, and that's the problem. When wording becomes perverted, we don't know what we are talking about. Regulation is not a dirty word. It doesn't mean control. And the government, democratic government, using democratic means to regulate the media sector so that it would work better for the benefit of the public is a great thing. Everybody would agree on that. Nobody wants the government to control the media, control the contents. This is very different. And of course, some people try to put these words together and create confusion. It's the same with having a regulation. It's normal to have regulation. What we don't want is oppression. So it's very important to pay attention to this wording. We're in a period when press freedom is recessing almost everywhere in the world. And this is very important that we are able to make these definitions clear and make sure that governments that emanate from the people can work in the interest of the people.
Right. Going back to talking about the regulations, one of the hallmarks of a democratic society, a democratic government, is that we have elections and we have different political parties that come into power, that become elected. With regards to regulations, is it such a taboo or sensitive subject that it becomes perhaps more difficult in a democratic society or a democratic regime, do you think? Any takers? Kai-shi, thank you.
In a democratic society, nothing is more important than an informed electorate. Nothing is more important than the informed electorate. So, but then, how do we get informed? The information should come into us through the fourth estate. Again, is one of the most important pillars of democracy. But the fourth estate is not information dispenser only. Of course, it has to have a contact of humanity and then the social, moral, and then also the value that we uphold. So information has character, which make you think, what's the difference between a characteristic information than the political propaganda? Well, that again invites the question of what kind of informed electorate can play in correcting the direction of the media code, ethic code. I think here in Taiwan we see a perfect example of this chaos, of this need of government intervention. Sometimes we want government to have nothing to do with information society, because the media is supposed to be the power of check and balance of the government. We're supposed to supervise them, but at the same time, to government is what we elected, what the people elected, and then put them forward in the position with power to protect our freedom, to help protect our freedom. So every time here in Taiwan, when we know there are people who believe in certain color of their party allegiance, for instance, like we believe the TV media has colors. There are green TV stations, there are blue TV stations, but then also at the end, they are electorate. They are people, they are recipient of information who can make the choice, who handles the remote control in their hands, and then who also type with in their keyboards to express, to narrate, to give pressure to information broadcasters. So I think any effort from either the people, civil society, from government, and from a moral, self-respecting media should be making the effort for more critical thinking. And Taiwan, I think, is coming along that way in the last many years. And then one good thing about democracy that I become I'm a democracy activist for 3 decades now in exile, but I become more and more believe in democracy, is that democracy gives us opportunities to correct our own mistakes. And our own mistakes hurt ourselves. And that's why next time, when we have a chance to cast our ballots, we will do it more carefully after we were hurt. So I think, again, each party played a role to create a society with more informed and critical thinking electorate that gives us, at the end, biggest benefit.
Yeah, to add to this, nobody wants governments to regulate the media content, but it is the role of governments to regulate every sector of the economy, and the media are one important sector of the economy. And actually the economy of the media somehow conditions how the media work. You remember earlier we talked about a certain balance of forces. You've got the public gives its power to delegates and uses the media to hold the delegates accountable. The problem is where the media where the media's money comes from, because in the past, even if the media were much stronger than they are now, because they lost a lot of their power that was taken by online platforms, but the public was still paying every day. You were buying a newspaper, meaning that if you dislike that media, you stopped buying, and they had to take this in consideration. There was a minimum seriousness to be provided to readers, because readers used to pay. Now what is it with the internet? Everything's for free. So you get basically what you pay for. Like someone said, if you don't see where's the product, you are the product. And in the media sector, this is totally the case. So actually the public has lost its power. And that's somehow the real problem. In a report published last year by Reporters Without Borders, we were talking about the Chinese regime's influence in the world, in the media. Of course, there's tons of money, and the best media in Western democracies, they are looking for money, they are craving for money. So when the Chinese government comes with a lot of money to buy a luxury advertising in their media, they have to say yes. It's a question of survival. So the economy is really important for the media sector, and that's why it's so important that governments would regulate this part.
Right, Cedric. We're just going to open up for Q&A shortly, but before I do so, I was wondering if any of our panelists would like to make any remarks. Please. Thank you, Eva.
I think Sergey talked about money or the economy. I think the more fundamental issue is that media is constituted by people, by the journalists, and with the influence of the money, the journalists may change. And based on our survey at Media Watch, well, I don't know about other countries, but it's getting more and more serious in Taiwan. Placement, ads. Well, media, especially larger media now, have a business unit to serve the enterprises and entrepreneurs. If that doesn't change for the media, of course, the problem not only comes from big capital. I talk about disclosure about the capital and shareholders, but also with the current operation model, well, especially this is a difficulty for a smaller media. The journalists are the people who produce news. Are they able to work independently and to fight for the freedom of press? But the other side of that freedom is self-regulation. So who is really the boss? Who is your boss? How much discretion you can have under your boss? I think this has a lot to do whether or not the media can stay independent and free. But I believe that no countries currently have regulations on media, on their business. So maybe media should not be allowed to sell their space. But currently, there isn't much of that regulation. Many of the senior journalists transfer to the business units because they're very good at writing. So they think that if they work in the business department, at least I can serve as a gatekeeper. I can't keep the bad things away, like 10% or 20% instead of all of them. So I think new journalists, when entering the media, they all learn to protect themselves because the boss may require them to write something, and that is different from what they want to write independently. There is a boundary, and for new journalists, they're trying to balance their livelihood and their career or their heart to be a journalist. And just like where Kai-Shi said, I think there should be a regulation. Of course, people may think that, oh, this regulation is kind of restriction, but is it really so? I think it takes more discussions. The people who have the entry level do not have that many choices, especially when they need to support the family. To follow what Eva said, we talk about placement or ads made by the government. I think right after Chen Shui-bian's administration and at the beginning of Ma Ying-jeou's government, and people like Huang Zebing wrote an article claiming that the government is buying media, they're placing ads in the media. And there was the amendment to the budget law then, still under Ma Ying-jeou's government. So government isn't forbid to purchase or to place ads, but if they purchase or place the ads, they have to make it clear that this is a government ad. Now it's been 10 years. If we look backward and at all these changes in the media, especially with the rise of social media such as Facebook and other platforms, they have bigger influence compared to traditional media. So what we are observing is that the government purchase is more refined now. We've seen some bids to government project. For example, a company want to win the bid, and I can be a magazine, a company, and I join the tender of the bid, but I also provide other services in addition to the ads or the promotion that I promised to give you according to the contract. I also promise that if there is an emergency, if there's a PR crisis, for example, something bad happened, I promise that we can provide clarification. We will utilize our social media to manipulate the public opinions. I cannot promise to reverse the public opinions, but I can try. So when media service providers try to win a bid from the government, this is the value-added services they're trying to provide at the same time, and there is no law to regulate that. And when the government evaluates these bidders, if a bidder can provide extra service, of course, it's more likely for him or her to win this bid. And I don't think this kind of extra services should be provided, and the government should not take it into consideration when deciding who is going to win the bid. But media, of course, is the biggest stakeholder in all these discussions and debates, and therefore these issues are seldomly disclosed to the public. So according to the budget law, I mentioned that the government needs to make it clear that this is a government ad. But in addition to that, I think what I've described should also be regulated by the law. I think someone should at least start the discussions. I don't know whether Global View magazine has their people here. I think there was Huang Jianting, who used to be the deputy magistrate of Taidong, was now working in the control yuan, and he said that he was ranked 5-star magistrate by the Global View. And another person, Yang Suo, said that the 5-star ranking means nothing. To tell the truth, Global View, in order to win the government bid, will provide this kind of services. So the government, in other words, will place ads in the magazine, and that's how you get the 5-star ranking. So Yang Suo published that article to criticize Wang, and this is also a criticism against Global View. So we need to think about that when government place ads, they are using taxpayers' money to influence the media, to influence the electorate and their vote. And the Global View magazine decided to file a lawsuit against Yang Suo. And when we saw news about this, many people from the media support Ms. Yang Suo, who disclosed Global View's practice, and I repost Ms. Yang Suo's post. So I volunteered to be sued by Global View magazine. Why is that? Because if that lawsuit became the reality, then it would be an opportunity to discuss this issue, because in the past, the media didn't disclose this practice, and there was no people, talking about this. So maybe the Global View is not present today, but anyway, as Cedric said, we are in an era of capitalism, and Taiwan is a society of capitalism. So people tend to think that, it makes a lot of sense to make money, to support our livelihood. So everything to make money is rationale. But well, this is not right. There are private hospitals. Of course, they have to generate revenue, but they also have to save patients if a patient fainted in front of their door. Of course, the private hospitals want to make money, but they also need to educate their doctors that, okay, the reason why doctors have their license to practice is because they are taking some social responsibilities. And well, transportation is also a public business, so they should also take the responsibilities. So if the bus is not making money, should we just shut it down? Well, but transportation or media need to take certain social responsibilities. Journalists are not just employees to some media. They have the social responsibility, and the boss of the media needs to know that you're not just a boss of the media, you are also an individual who need to take social responsibility.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kai-Shi.
Who need to take social responsibility.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kai-Shi. That's really interesting. Yeah, one remark and one thing that I believe can give us a little bit of hope. The remark is that our original topic was what role should democratic governments play in defending press freedom worldwide? And we didn't talk about worldwide, and that's actually a good reason, because currently democratic governments are struggling with their own problems, and as long as they are not an exemplar, as long as it doesn't work properly on their own ground, they cannot be a countermodel to authoritarianism. That's exactly the case for Taiwan, which, yes, is not bad, has a okay press freedom if compared to the average in the world. It's number 2 in Asia, yes, but the problem is that in Asia it's mostly authoritarian countries, and if you look close, well, Taiwan still has a long way, as every democracy has. So that's my remark, and we could talk literally for hours or days, because this is a very complicated question. One beacon of hope. There are more and more media created by journalists who don't want to be in that system anymore. And nowadays, with the internet, it's possible to create low-cost media, but that do not produce low-cost information, that produce high-quality information. Well, there are some that we know: Initium, Hong Kong Free Press, Citizen News, still in Hong Kong. The Reporter in Taiwan. I'm sorry, my memory is not so good, but our friends will help us complete. So all these media are very important. Why? Because they are not for profit. Some of them were created through crowdfunding. Most of them receive money from their readers through subscription. Some of them are not registered as for-profit entities, but as non-profit organizations. So this might be the future of the media, because you pay, you order the music, you subscribe to a media, you believe in that media, you know the people who write for this media, and if one day you stop believing in this media, you stop paying. That's the best sanction economy again. So I believe this is a model that is going to develop, because obviously it somehow addresses some needs of the citizens. And as I often say, like sometimes you may feel that casting a ballot is not so useful or not as useful as you would like, but there's other ways to be a citizen. And one way to be a citizen is to support a media you believe in, and this might be as efficient as only going to vote.
Thank you, Cedric. With that said, I would like to open the floor up for questions for the panelists. Yes?
First of all, thank you so much for your very thoughtful remarks. It was a really fascinating discussion. So you talked a lot about the responsibility of media organizations to convey truth to the population. And I think, you also mentioned that governments have a responsibility to regulate media in such a way that allows for the facilitation of press freedom. In the United States, however, just to give an example, we've seen the media use these freedoms in a way to actually spread information that's extremely dangerous. While it may be true in some cases, can come with a certain set of very scary biases. So I'm curious to know, from your perspectives, where the balance is from freedom of speech, as in, the ability to say whatever you like, no matter how harmful it can be to any number of groups of people, versus the freedom of press to actually convey whatever and report on whatever story you want to report on. How do you see these two different types of freedoms in playing together or in conflict with each other?
Interesting question. Are those freedoms, how do they coexist? Are they mutually exclusive? Who would like to tackle this one? Kai-shi.
Seems like I'm really hanging on to this microphone a lot, sorry. Yes, freedom from. If you define the freedom from with that as like a passive freedom, that can help you determine when two freedom clashes. You defend the freedom for the mass from deprivation of information. So you examine each case with that category, with that a ruler, and then find out in which way, when they clash, you should lean toward and defend more. That's my take on your question. Thank you. Did I answer? Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
So at this point in time, information is basically infinite. Compared to, say, even 100 years ago, we had very little information. We had to depend on the media for information. But nowadays, like, it's mostly trash. It's like Instagram photos, like people just blogging about their day. It's mostly trash. So nowadays, the media is basically filtering this information and picking and choosing and telling the people, okay, what's important and what's not. So has the journalistic community adapted to this? If so, how does this, is this like an additional responsibility? Yeah, that's my question.
So it sounds like, and thank you for your question. I believe the point that was mentioned is that with information being so readily available and easily accessible, and one of the things that was also touched on is perhaps when we do receive news, there's algorithms built in there to help us filter the type of news that we receive. So perhaps we keep receiving news that we already believe in or have already adhered to. In a way, it denies us a more diverse access to varied news from different perspectives. Cedric, yes?
Yes, I believe you're totally right. We are submerged with information, but it's not the information we want. And actually, it might be in the interest of some people, of some forces in power to submerge us with irrelevant information, so we are not going to pay attention to the information that is relevant. Similarly, a reporter who would go to a conference, to a press conference, let's say to a political leader's press conference, and would only report what that leader has said, did not do his or her job. The job of a journalist is to put this in perspective with what the leader said last year, what the leader has done or not done compared to that, what that person has said. So yes, the role of journalist is super important because it's somehow putting information in perspective. And somehow, some people say, like, I don't know how to say that in English, they say like reporters, they do the trash, they go to the trash can, they go pick it. Yes, well, that's actually a badge of honor. That's what journalism should be. Yeah, it's not the most glamour profession with this regard, but that's the job of a journalist. A journalist that just goes and picks nice and easy stories that please everyone, in my sense, is not a journalist. Journalism, if defined as a way for the public to hold the powerful accountable, journalism has to do this, and this is a badge of honor.
Yes, and I'm so sorry, just one moment. Zhida also wanted to make a comment with regards to that question.
谢谢，多说两句啊。
Thank you. Allow me just to say one or two things.
刚才那位先生提问我是认同的。
I agree with what this gentleman mentioned. Today, when we talk about the work of the press, we can see it's very different from the past, even though we still call journalists journalists. But today, there is it's a very different nature when we look at the work we do. For example, every night, there is 1 hour of primetime news. In the past, in order to compile an hour's worth of news, our methodology was very different. We can see that everything went through the journalist before it was conveyed to the public. So there was packaging that was done by the journalist beforehand. But today, we can see there are many journalists who still hold on to the past model that I just described. But actually, this kind of press no longer can answer the needs of this generation. We have so much information at our disposal. So we need a much more powerful kind of journalist. Today, what we need is for the journalists to help us focus on what is important. Tell me what I should notice about this issue. For example, we know recently there was an issue of a temple that had too much noise, and where legislators were there singing at a very high decibel, and people covered the news by interviewing the mayor of Taipei. All of these elements makes the public think that they already knew what happened. But do you really, through these fragments, know what happened? As a news source or as a media, it's very important today to direct this kind of issue to something that you believe needs to be valued. For example, a temple festival. To what degree is it allowed to interfere with people's lives? Why is it that everybody, government officials, legislators, feel that they need to kowtow to temples? What is the background for something like that? I think only through this kind of processing can you package the news so that the general public will learn something, or they continue to pay you a fee for you to continue to report on what's important. So I think today when we look at the work that journalists are doing, it's changing, but very few people actually really understand this change.
On your question for one more moment, I know that Kai-shi also wanted to comment. No? Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you for your patience. Your question?
Yes. Actually, I want to ask more about the role of democratic government instead of press freedom in particular. Because, for example, in some democratic governments now, there are a lot of political upheavals, and then sometimes riot might happen, demonstrations might happen. And then in some cases, the governments would somehow restrict internets. And for example, like one case last year in Indonesia, they restrict for 3 days the flow of internet. It's not like you cannot get access to internet at all. You can get access, but it's very restricted. You cannot send videos, you cannot even send photos. So it's basically they limit the internet for, they said that it's for curbing the spread of hoaxes and fake news, because it's very sensitive and it can cause even riots, even more chaos. So what is your take on that? Do you think that it's legal? I mean, do you think it's logical for democratic governments, or do you think it's actually illiberal? Because that action is actually condemned by Western media and some Human Rights Watch or human rights organization as illiberal and undemocratic. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your question. Cedric, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, very quickly. Yes, it's totally illegitimate to try and restrict the possibility of the people to express themselves, and especially when it's a moment of demonstration where there might be actually things happening that must be brought to the attention of the public. But we know it's difficult, like the fight against disinformation. We talked about it last year during the seminar. It's something complicated, and somehow democracies can very easily lose their soul in this fight by using means that are actually authoritarian means, and sometimes even like without thinking it's going to be wrong, but because the government would say, we know that this news is incorrect, so we should delete it. But the problem, if you start doing this in Taiwan, for example, then you're somehow doing what you reproach to the Chinese government. And then where is the limit? That's the problem for democracies. So that's why democracies need so much a journalism, a healthy journalism environment, because journalists are the ones that are going to somehow make fake news become irrelevant, because people won't pay attention to fake news. Why do fake news work so well in many places? Because the public has lost their faith, their trust in the traditional media. So maybe to conclude, what should governments do for freedom of the press is to actively work in restoring the trust between the public and the media. And that requests active work. There's a lot of things to do. Media literacy, of course, but it takes one generation at best. Restore a healthy economy so that the media would make more money while reporting quality news than they currently made while reporting poor quality news, and so on and so on. Fortunately, we could talk for hours on this topic, but I wish you all join us for the next event Reporters Without Borders will organize, maybe in March. And then thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Cedric. Did that answer your question? Okay, great. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing. The question I would like to ask is, we know that regulation is very important in a democracy. It also helps to hold the media accountable. However, I think discussion is such an important mechanism as well. What can we do to bring about more discussion amongst the different stakeholders? For example, today, there's only people who are here are already aware of the ramifications of press freedoms, and people who are not privy are still being manipulated. So what can we do to bring about more dialogue and discussion?
What can be done to enliven, to bring more to the discourse? Eva?
For a person who has been observing and monitoring the media, and also as a person who has a lot of interaction with the people, because we have received complaints from the people, based on that experience, I think laws are the last resort, and it should not be the prioritized resort. And as we talked about before, is law a necessary measure in a democracy? Well, I think Taiwan is a place with democratic spirits, but we don't have the democratic literacy yet. That is to say, our society is not yet democratic enough to be open to all kinds of speeches. I think some panelists have mentioned this already. Now we're seeing a lot of segments in media. There are self-media, smaller media. They target different audience. It's very different from previous times when there were only traditional media, or when under the authoritarian regime there were only 2 TV stations or 1. But even for authoritarian regime, there's still followers. So I think before we talk about law, we can talk about the society and people's views. What kind of monitoring can people implement? And should we uphold outside regulation over self-regulation, or the other way around? I think some of you have talked about boundaries and limits. Some things are out of the boundary. So, for example, hate speech, radical speech. But what is radical speech? So we've been discussing what kind of suicide news shall not be covered. So there should be some principle. But if a celebrity committed suicide, should we cover that story? So that selection has a lot to do with what freedom we have. And the other thing is our preference for news. Every different target groups, and we have, for example, say if I like what Mr. Lee said and I don't like what Wu Kai-shi said, so Wu Kai-shi shouldn't be allowed to speak what he wants. But that's what I call a preference, and that preference is quite obvious among the people. Let me give you an example. The TV stations with the highest credibilities, with the top 3, are in fact the top 3 stations which people hated the most. So it's really hard to tell whether people prefer the accuracy that a TV station can give to you. I think Cedric said this earlier. A journalist shouldn't just copy and paste, but that's easy. And that kind of easy pieces are popular. So the internet news are easy news, easy doing, easy going, or the news that are captured by the dashboard, that's easy news too. But all in all, I still think that laws are the last resort. What really matters is people's media literacy, and that literacy needs the owners of the media and the media itself to help the people to build up this literacy. Of course, media is still a commercial entity, but how does it limit its commercial influence, and how does it make its capital more transparent? I think that's the key for media.
This concludes the second Taiwan International Journalism Conference. I would like to thank all of our panelists and all of our attendees for your questions, as well as all of our co-organizers, guest speakers, sponsors, and partners. Thank you for your participation and your engagement. Next, we will be holding the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Awards. Please kindly stay behind. And for the viewers online, please continue to join us as we proceed with the awards ceremony. For live streaming, please visit the RSF Facebook page. Thank you.
Thank you. So the award ceremony will start at 4:30, right?
That's right, yes. The award ceremony will begin at 4:30. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Awards 2020. RSF has been working to promote and defend press freedom globally since 1985. The organization brings a unique and important contribution to global democracy by providing assistance to journalists around the world and fighting for the protection of press freedom wherever it is under attack. The RSF Press Freedom Awards are designed to honor journalists who, by their courage or independence, or the impact of their investigations and reporting, particularly embody the ideals of journalism that we defend. This year, there are 7 journalists, 4 of them women, and 5 media outlets or journalists associations who have been nominated in 3 prize categories: for courage, impact, and independence. These include journalists or investigative media from Russia, Brazil, the Philippines, India, and France. Before we present the awards, I would like to invite Mr. Cedric Alviani, the head of Reporters Without Borders East Asia Bureau, to give the opening remarks.
Thank you. It's my honor to open the 2020 Press Freedom Award ceremony organized by Reporters Without Borders. After London last year, after London in 2018 and Berlin in 2019, this event is hosted this year at the National Central Library in Taipei, capital of Taiwan. This award was launched in 1992, and since it has been honoring every year independent journalists and media who have faced threats of imprisonment for their work, who dared challenge of abuse of power of freedom, and it's never been so necessary to have this award. After all these years, this award is still so necessary. The COVID-19 pandemic has provided new evidence of the universal need for independent journalism. In our globalized world, violations of the basic freedom are a matter for an entire international community, regardless of where they occur. The RSF Press Freedom Awards are here to remind us of that. Without journalists, the respect of human rights and the rule of law simply cannot be guaranteed. A world without journalism is a world in which the people are not citizens, they are subjects. A world without journalism is a world in which no one should have to live. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric. Our General Secretary, Christophe Delors, who along with other guests, unfortunately could not be in attendance today due to challenges posed by COVID-19 restrictions. Here is a video of Christophe's remarks.
Nous sommes extrêmement honorés, et je parle au nom de l'équipe de Reporters sans frontières, d'être avec vous ce soir dans la salle de cérémonie à Taipei et partout où dans le monde vous êtes en train de nous regarder. Cette cérémonie du prix RSF 2020 pour la liberté de la presse prend une couleur particulière. Parce que nous entrons dans une décennie décisive pour le journalisme. Parce que la crise sanitaire, la crise de la Covid-19, amplifie toutes les crises qui déjà affectent le journalisme. La crise géopolitique, avec des États autoritaires qui veulent imposer leur vision, leur ordre de l'information. Avec une crise démocratique, une croissance de la polarisation, de la défiance vis-à-vis des journalistes, des fausses informations, des rumeurs. Une crise économique qui affecte les médias et qui parfois sape leur capacité à travailler. Et enfin une crise technologique avec des plateformes numériques qui aujourd'hui édictent les lois de l'espace digital. Nous devons leur imposer des garanties démocratiques. Nous sommes très heureux, je le disais, d'être à Taipei. Parce qu'en 2017, nous y avons ouvert un bureau qui couvre l'Asie du Nord et de l'Est. Et ce bureau, depuis, s'est développé a effectué un travail extraordinaire, combat tous les jours pour la liberté de la presse dans la région et ailleurs, et je tiens, devant vous, à adresser mes félicitations à l'ensemble de l'équipe et notamment à son directeur, Cédric Albiani. Notre organisation, Reporters sans frontières, pour ce prix a nominé 12 journalistes. 12 journalistes ou médias qui incarnent le journalisme tel que nous en avons la vision. C'est-à-dire une vision exigeante, une vision de journalistes qui ont de l'impact, qui exercent de manière indépendante, qui font preuve de courage en mettant en œuvre des méthodes professionnelles et en respectant les règles éthiques du journalisme. Ce prix, il permet de leur rendre hommage, mais il permet plus encore de les soutenir. Et je souhaite vraiment que ce prix serve, y compris les journalistes nominés, qui ce soir ne seront pas lauréats, et que je salue par avance. J'adresse un message particulier à tous les anciens lauréats du prix RSF pour la liberté de la presse qui sont harcelés, qui sont poursuivis, qui sont persécutés et qui sont emprisonnés. J'ai une pensée particulière ce soir pour Sohail Arabi en Iran, pour Raif Badawi en Arabie Saoudite, pour Wang Shi en Chine et pour Pham Don Trang au Vietnam. L'an dernier, nous avons remis, lors de l'édition 2019, le prix du courage à Pham Don Trang. C'est une journaliste vietnamienne, extraordinaire. Avant d'être arrêtée il y a 2 mois, elle a signé une lettre qu'elle avait laissée au cas où elle serait arrêtée, et dans laquelle elle écrivait « Je ne me bats pas pour ma liberté, je me bats pour quelque chose de plus grand, ma liberté ce serait trop facile, je me bats pour la liberté du Vietnam ». Nous avons lancé une pétition pour elle que je vous invite à signer, à faire circuler, ça fait partie de nos modes d'action. Tous les journalistes qui sont lauréats, qui sont nominés, et des milliers d'autres journalistes partout dans le monde, se battent pour ça. Pas pour leur propre liberté, mais pour celle de leur pays et pour celle du reste du monde. Ce soir, nous allons leur rendre hommage.
It is my honor to now present the remarks from Mr. Dong-Hoon Kim, the President of the Journalists Association of Korea.
안녕하세요. 한국기자협회 회장 김동훈입니다. 먼저 국경 없는 기자회가 주최하는 언론 자유상 수상자들에게 대한민국 기자들을 대표해서 축하의 말씀 전해드립니다. 지금 전 세계가 페이크 뉴스를 비롯한 여러 가지 문제로 저널리즘의 신뢰에 위협을 받고 있습니다. 따라서 우리 기자들은 저널리즘의 신뢰 회복을 위해 부단히 노력해야 할 것입니다. 한국기자협회는 국경 없는 기자회와 공동으로 여러 성공적 활동을 해왔던 것처럼 언론 자유와 저널리즘의 신뢰 회복을 위해서 공조할 것이며 앞으로도 국경 없는 기자회와의 활동에 지지와 성원을 보내드립니다. 불굴의 의지와 신념으로 바르고 정확한 보도를 위해 애써주시는 전 세계 언론인들에게 경의를 표합니다. 그리고 다시 한번 오늘 수상자 여러분 모두에게 축하 인사 말씀을 전해드립니다. 감사합니다.
It is my privilege to now introduce Ms. Shihori Ito, a Japanese journalist who was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2020.
Hi, my name is Shihori Ito. I'm a journalist from Japan, and congratulations for those winning these amazing awards. Your winning is very empowering to all of us. And as a female journalist, I've been facing all these difficulties against online harassment, especially I'm also a rape survivor. And it has been quite difficult to talk within in media as well. So it is certainly not easy time to work. But I believe as we keep doing our work, as we keep having our faith in journalism and sending all the positive words and support our fellow journalists, we can keep our work. So again, congratulations.
Every day, numerous incredible journalists stand at the forefront, often working under hard and difficult conditions, fighting for press freedom. This year, the jury of the 28th RSF Press Freedom Awards, consisting of prominent journalists and free speech defenders from all around the world, chaired by RSF President Pierre Haskey, had the extremely difficult task of identifying the winners for this year's awards. Let us now listen to Pierre's remarks.
Ils sont réunis à Taipei, je donnerais cher pour être à vos côtés, mais la crise sanitaire fait que nous sommes sur des continents différents. Et bonjour aussi à tous ceux qui nous suivent en ligne pour cette cérémonie ce soir et cette rencontre. J'ai eu le plaisir et l'honneur de présider cette année le jury qui a décerné les prix de la liberté de la presse de Reporters sans frontières, avec un jury de personnalités extrêmement engagées et qualifiées dans la défense de la liberté de la presse et de la liberté d'expression, venus de plusieurs parties du monde. Des gens qui viennent d'Inde, de France, d'Allemagne, de Russie, de Syrie, de Tanzanie, et j'en oublie sûrement. Notre tâche a été extrêmement difficile, je dois dire, et presque cruelle, car tous les nominés, et ça, là je reflète la conversation et la discussion que nous avons eue entre membres du jury, tous les nominés méritaient cette année d'être primés. Nous avons été extrêmement impressionnés par les parcours, les personnalités et les combats qu'ils mènent, et il a été très difficile de trancher, mais c'est la règle du jeu d'un prix, il faut qu'il y ait des lauréats, donc c'est ce que nous avons fait avec beaucoup de difficultés, parce que nous étions d'accord sur le fait que tous le méritaient. Il y a donc cette année 3 prix, le courage, l'impact et l'indépendance. Et nous avons ajouté un 4e prix, un prix spécial du jury cette année, vous le découvrirez un petit peu plus tard. Alors je voudrais d'abord remercier les membres du jury qui se sont véritablement impliqués et engagés dans cette discussion. Rana Ayoub, Raphaël Baquet, Mazen Darwish, Zaina Erahim, Eric Kabendera, Hamid Mir, Frédéric Obermeyer et Michael Zigar. Nous avons eu une discussion approfondie, riche, dense sur ces enjeux de la liberté de la presse et sur les combats que mènent les différentes personnes qui ont été nominées. Et je pense que je résume le point de vue de tout le jury en leur rendant hommage à leur ténacité, à leur intégrité et à l'âpreté avec laquelle ils mènent ces combats dans des difficultés que vous pouvez imaginer, et leurs parcours sont absolument exemplaires. Donc bravo à eux, et nous continuerons à les soutenir de la meilleure manière qui soit. Merci à vous et bonne soirée.
And now an introduction of the jury of the 28th RSF Press Freedom Awards. This year's jury members are Reina Ayoub, an Indian journalist and Washington Post opinion columnist, Raphael Baki, a leading French reporter for Le Monde, Mazen Darwish, a Syrian lawyer and president of the Syrian Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, Zaina Erhaim, a Syrian journalist and communication manager at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, Eric Kabendera, a Tanzanian investigative reporter, Hamid Mir, a Pakistani reporter, columnist, and author, Frederick Obermeyer, a German investigative journalist with Munich's Süddeutsche Zeitung newspaper, and Mikhail Zagar, a Russian journalist and founding editor-in-chief of Docht, Russia's only independent TV news channel. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin today's awards ceremony. The first award we will be presenting is the Independence Award, which celebrates resistance to outside pressures. And here to present the Independence Award is Mr. Ding Ming Lai. Mr. Lai is a member of the Control Yuan and former president of Shixing University. Mr. Lai has also long been dedicated to media reform issues and is the former member of several media NGOs in Taiwan. Mr. Lai.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to be here at the ceremony. Before coming to the control yuan, I used to be the chair of the Taiwan Media Observation and the Fact-Checking Center. I remember that many years ago, when I was the chair of the Taiwan Media Observation Foundation, Mr. Wu Kai-shi brought the delegation from RSF to Taipei because at that time they were considering a location to open their branch. And we were able to persuade them Taipei is a good location, and we're happy that RSF ended in choosing Taipei. And we are here at their events every year. And it means a lot to me to be here to present the Independence Award. This award is given to people who are not scared by political or economic pressure, who continue to pursue justice and truth. This award is given to individual media or NGO. There are 4 nominees this year from Egypt, Hungary, Cambodia, and Nicaragua. 2 of them are journalists. One is NGO, and the other is a daily news. When facing extreme difficulties, they are able to uphold their ideal. I think in Taiwan, we have experienced the authoritarian regime ourselves, so we want to extend our admiration to these people who continue to pursue justice and truth. I personally admire them a lot.
The Independence Award nominees. Lina Atala, Peter Wee, Cambodian Journalist Alliance, La Prensa.
And the winner is Lina Atala. Congratulations.
Je remercie l'organisation Reporters sans frontières pour ce prix et en cette occasion, je rappelle que le journalisme indépendant est un droit humain auquel nous tous devons avoir accès. Ce que nous faisons à Madame, ce n'est qu'une contribution pour garantir qu'une information conçue indépendamment et professionnellement malgré toutes les circonstances est toujours possible en Égypte malgré toutes les circonstances.
Thank you, Mr. Lai. Next, we will be presenting the Courage Award in recognition of outstanding courage in the practice, defense, or promotion of journalism in the face of hostility, or even at the risk of personal safety. Please welcome the presenter for this award, Mr. Zhide Li. Mr. Li is a member of the Association of Taiwan Journalists Executive Committee. The Association of Taiwan Journalists is an organization formed by journalists, students, and members of the public. The goal of ATJ is to protect press freedom and improve news professionalism and independence. Mr. Li is also a well-known journalist in Taiwan and previously the news director in public television service and the chief editor in Intinuum Media. Mr. Li?
I'm very, very honored to be here to introduce our 4 nominees for the Prize for Courage. I think if you know what they have had to undergo, you will realize that they are unsung heroes and they are worthy of our praise. Allow me to briefly introduce them to you. First, hailing from Russia, Elena Milashina. She is an investigative reporter for the Moscow tri-weekly Novaya Gazeta. She has been covering Chechnya for a long time, and as a result, she has received death threats and censorship. She has also reported on the Chechen government's mismanagement of the COVID-19 crisis. Her article was removed from the newspaper's website in April. And the second nominee is Margarita Valle from Davao Today, from the Philippines. Even though she was arrested and held secretly for several days in 2019, but she has unflinchingly continued to expose human rights abuses in the southwestern Philippines region, which is under martial law. And Davao is actually the homeland of Duterte, so she was subject at an early stage to the Duterte system. During his long period as mayor of Davao, before Duterte ran for president. The next nominee comes from Kashmir, Ms. Fahad Shah. He is the editor of the main investigative website, the Kashmir Wala. Fahad Shah is regularly subjected to, through police questioning, threat, and intimidation attempts for his reports. He has also been forced to reveal his sources, which he refused to do under any circumstances. He has been the target of physical assault, and the outlet he runs has played a prominent part in defending press freedom, using innovative methods to keep 8 million Kashmiris informed, despite the censorship which was implemented when the territory's autonomy was rescinded in August. Also, we want to recognize another nominee, Mohammad Musad, who was questioned by Revolutionary Guard agents in February this year and criticized for the government's lack of preparation for the coronavirus outbreak.
Elena Milashina, Margarita Valle, Fahad Shah, Mohammad Mosaed.
The prize for courage goes to Elena Milashina.
Hi, I'm very honored to receive this prize and to be in such a great company of brilliant journalists from all over the world. Thank you for honoring me today, and I should say that it's not my first prize for the courage, and still I can use to the situation then that it's not enough for the journalists to be just talented to find the truth. Journalists have to be brave enough to bring it to the light. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Next is the Impact Award, which recognizes work that has led to concrete improvement in journalistic freedom, independence, and pluralism, or an increase in awareness of these matters. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Xihua Tang, the CEO of Taiwan Media Watch. Ms. Tang has long been dedicated to human rights and health-related policy and has a strong interest in the media environment of Taiwan. Taiwan Media Watch is a nonprofit organization which was formed by academics, media workers, and people who care for the media environment. It is the first organization in Taiwan to place a focus on media reform. The goal of Taiwan Media Watch is to improve media literacy and protect the rights and independence of journalists. Ms. Tang?
Thank you.
I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce the nominees for the prize for impact. I think journalists make the world a better place. Therefore, we hope to encourage members of the press, journalists, to continue under very difficult circumstances. We need to stand by our principles of press freedom and reporting on as many diverse voices as possible. We need to change the world for the better. There are 4 nominees for the Impact Prize. They come from Djibouti, France, Afghanistan, and Brazil. These are organizations and people who have continued to stand by the highest ethics of journalism. They continue to care for minority groups, shine a light on the underserved. Let's look at the 4 nominees.
The Impact Award nominees. La Voix de Djibouti, Disclose, Merman Radio, Cecilia Oliveira.
I think it's important to first congratulate every one of the nominees. All of them deserve to get this prize. For the Impact Award, I would like to recognize from Afghanistan, Merman Radio.
دریافت جایزه با ما کمک کردن به خصوص نهاد خبرنگاران بدون مرز و همچنان امید دارم که بیش از پیش بتانیم بستر خدمت واقع شویم و بسیار خوشحال هستم که رادیوی ما تونست جایزه را دریافت کنه.
Thank you, Ms. Tang. This year, in addition to the prizes for independence, impact, and courage, the RSF Press Freedom Awards jury have decided to award a special prize to honor one outstanding press freedom defender. I would like to now invite our presenter, Mr. Wu Kai-shi, RSF Emeritus Board Member and Deputy Secretary General of the Taiwan Parliamentary Human Rights Commission, to present this special prize.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We have entered 21st century for 2 decades now. And in these 2 decades, we have cultivated godly technologies. It shrunk the world. We can travel from to any corner of the world within 24 hours. Mankind has also reached ability to eliminate many diseases, and we would sink. We would sink. We should live in a world of bliss of these technologies, free from hunger, war, and deprivation of freedom. Unfortunately, we don't live in that brave, ideal, and honest world. In that brave, ideal, honest world, RSF Award should be a celebration of professionalism, celebration of media men and women for bringing joyful news to us. Again, we are not living in that world. In fact, RSF Awards were given to heroes still struggling for freedom in this 21st century. One of those heroes is my best friend and mentor, Liu Xiaobo. In year 2006, he received RSF's Press Freedom Award, whose tragic death in Chinese prison is also a painful remark, a reminder of the lack of freedom in today's world. I shall also bring your attention to another brave journalist from China who is also a former laureate of RSF Press Freedom Award, Huang Xi, who now, unfortunately, also living in Chinese prison, suffering illness and being denied treatment. These people set an example for journalism in 21st century and remind us that being courageous is still a quality of today's award. And this year's special award is also given to someone of these qualities. Recipient this year's cannot come to, many of the recipients earlier we saw for different awards cannot come to this ceremony due to the pandemic. But this year's special award laureate is not available for a different reason. RSF 2020 Press Freedom Special Award is currently being incarcerated for his courage and struggle, my friend Jimmy Lai.
Hello. I want to say thank you to Reporters Sans Frontier for the wonderful honor of being recognized by the RSF Press Freedom Award jury for 2020. The work Reporters Sans Frontiers is so important to reminding us in Asia and in the world of the value of open and free press. Now, our open and free press in Hong Kong is being clamped down by the CCP by using the national security law. We are not even allowed to demonstrate, and our democratic legislators have resigned from the Legislative Council. That means that there will be no news from Hong Kong. I'm afraid that without the news, the world will forget us. And please, fellow reporters, please keep on writing about us, voicing out for us, and draw the world attention to our pride being suppression. Your support for us to keep the free world value, which we are fighting in the frontier, is so important. Your voice and support is our saving grace. Thank you so much.
Mr. Jimmy Lai's video was previously re-recorded, and today we are honored to have Mr. Jimmy Lai's son, Mr. Sebastian Lai, here to accept the award on his behalf.
On behalf of my father and my family, I would like to thank RSF for honoring him with this award on his 73rd birthday. My sister went to see Dad on Saturday. He was led to the visiting window by God. Instead of his name, he was referred to as a number. Growing up, Dad always seemed to be in control. The sharp contrast paints a heartbreaking image. But is anyone truly ever in control? Absolute control demands a predictability that comes with a lack of free will. It is the quashing of all dissent. Dad and the brave many of Hong Kong, the small island in the great economic machine that is China, is a reminder that the quest for absolute control is futile. They are the cogs that refuse to roll over, the glitch in the matrix. And while you may lock them up, you will never control them. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Sebastian Lai. I would like to extend my congratulations to all of the deserving nominees and winners, and thank you to RSF for the continuous support and promotion of the vital work of courageous journalists from all around the world. I would also like to thank the generous partners who made this afternoon possible, and to the viewers online for your support of press freedom. We would now like to invite all of the participants who were on stage earlier to return to the stage for a group photo.